Hello, today we're going to look at your week 3 lab. Now I like this lab because it produces some pretty nicely formatted output. You're looking at the instructions right now. I'll go through a pretty thorough discussion of what the code looks like and why and how everything's supposed to work. If you made it through week 2, we're now getting to the part where we get to we're getting close to where we get to start solving some meaningful problems. Week 2 is tough because you got to get XAMPP up and running. You got to that's week 2 is the part where you realize just how important it is to name your files and manage your files and get everything into the right place on the web server. So there's just no way to ease into PHP, and so week 2 is tough in that regard. Week 3, I don't think that it's more difficult, but you're going to get a bunch more practice with all those same concepts from last week. And so without talking about it anymore, let's just get it started. I also want to mention that the assignment for this week is very, very similar to this lab. On your own, I think this could be a struggle for a lot of people. So it's one of the few weeks where I do a lab, which is almost exactly like the assignment. The assignment is your opportunity to apply these concepts on your own. It would be real easy for you to just kind of copy this lab and just change out some of the things. I wouldn't do that if I were you. I would rewrite it just so you get some practice with it. So anyways, we're going to be creating a checkerboard pattern like this. That's a 5x5 pattern. There's 2 pages. There's going to be the page with the form where the users enter the data. There's not really any PHP on that page. And then there's the other page with all the PHP, which does the processing. So the things worth talking about is that dimension for the board. Like, this is a 5x5 board. That dimension needs to be a number, it needs to be a whole number, and it needs to be a positive number. That probably makes sense. I think beyond that, I don't have a whole lot to add. The HTML needs to be valid. Have a footer on this page with your name on it. Mine doesn't have a footer, but I'm trying to make this short so you can watch it. Alright, here's what it looks like. So simple start page, really not a whole lot going on here. You just prompt the user for a dimension like 3, you click the button, and you get a 3x3 checkerboard. If I back out, don't get too carried away with this. You could put a giant number in there. This, I don't know how your eyes work, but that is like an optical illusion for me. It's pretty hard to stare at. I apologize for that. That's just kind of how it works. Alright, so that's how it functions. You've seen the instructions. Let's go have a look at the code, and I'll talk you through it. So you've got 2 pages. Don't really care what you call them. I tell you what to call them in the instructions, but I don't care. I'm just trying to give you an idea of what to call them. Right? I mean, it's going to be on the back end of a URL somewhere, so I don't care what you call it. This is the page. So you'll notice I kind of got my boilerplate things happening up here. A little bit of CSS. Most of that is optional. I guess it's all optional. Actually, you don't need any CSS on this page. So here's the magic, right? So I did a content div. For those of you that understand what a content div is, that's just the way that I make everything look centered on the page, and I have a background color. Form's real simple. Form just runs from there to there. It's got an action, and so that's the name of the script, which is going to process the data. I called it process check lab. You could call it something a little different if you want to, but I called it that. And the method is get, right? So there's get and there's post. Post doesn't really do anything for us here, so I'm going get. In reality, I guess it doesn't matter much. Here's my prompt. Notice I didn't use a label. I think it's important to show you that you do not need to use labels. Labels are particularly valuable for things like radio buttons and checkboxes because they make them easier to check, but if you just want text on the page, you can just write text on the page. It's fine. Just to show you what that looks like again, right? It just looks like that. I mean, that's one way you can do it. Especially when you've only got one input on your form, there's really no reason to use a label. Labels, you know this, but in the previous weeks we've used labels when you have like say 10 different text boxes and you want to align them. It helps to set all the labels to a uniform width, but there's nothing to align here. I've got a single input of type text. I set its name to dim. This is the dimension of the square. I don't know what you want to call it. You can call it whatever you want. I gave it an ID. Now the only reason I gave it an ID is because I wrote the CSS rule for it. Because by default it's pretty wide, and I just wanted to make it a little less wide. Completely optional. Name's important, and then here's my submit button, right? Type submit, value draw it. Pretty simple page. This is not going to be where you are putting most of your effort, right? And so that creates this thing right here, And so I head over here, I put in a number like 3. When I press that button, it passes it off to the other page, which is called Process Check Lab. Now, the first thing that might kind of stand out to you is the HTML and CSS is exactly the same. That's because I'm working with a boilerplate. So when I went and created my process, I have all the same rules, all the same boilerplate content, and the same general structure to the page. I just changed what's literally the only thing I changed was what is inside of this content div, and I put a bunch of stuff up here above the HTML tags. As I've discussed a couple times before, there's no wrong place or right place really to put your PHP, but what I try and do is I try and put all the logic up at the top before the HTML, and if I need to spit out some HTML down in the body of the document with echoes, then I put it down in the body of the document with the echoes. So my general scheme here, so just the way this works is I've got this variable. The first thing I do is I create a variable for output. This is going to be that message that is displayed on the screen. And so generally speaking, it might be a nothing message, but more often than not, I use that to spit out an error, right? An error message might be something like, hey, that's a negative number, knock it off, or that wasn't a number, or that number was negative, right? Just some kind of a message, or something was missing on the page. And generally speaking, you're going to need something like that. I defaulted it to just an H1 saying checkerboard. There's a lot of ways you can handle this. If you don't make a mistake, that is what's going to be displayed, and it's going to be displayed right here, right? So down in the div, I spit out something, and so I either say, hey, there's a checkerboard here, or I yell at them. So that's what that is. That's a good technique to kind of create your output variable up here in the big block, and then just spit it out down below on the page. So I default it to the positive message, if you will, and then I jump into an is set. Or sorry, more accurately, an if, and it runs from here to here. So I say, hey, if something was submitted with a name of dim, then we're in this if block right here. Otherwise, I spit out this message. You need to head back to the form and submit the data. And so that overwrites that. You see how I did that? I didn't concatenate it. I just completely replaced it. So that first if block is just checking for the presence of the variable. Then I head in here, and the first thing I do inside of an is set always is I just create a variable to store that, because that's pretty painful to write $_get square bracket dim. I don't like writing that over and over again, so I create a little variable to store it. It's very important that you don't do something like, I'm just going make-believe land here. You don't want to do that outside of an is set, because it would throw a warning. You cannot write this because sometimes that doesn't exist. Oops, I forgot the $, but you do not want to do this outside of an is set, because what if this variable doesn't exist? It should exist, but you can't be sure it's going to exist. So when if you're going to create your variables, they need to be created inside of an is set. And then I go down in here, and so here's where I'm validating the actual contents of that variable. So I'm going to make sure that that variable is not negative, and I'm going to make sure that it's a whole number. Now, one weird thing here is you might be thinking, well, what if they enter something like the word cat, or literally the word one, O-N-E? So how that ends up working is that's a default issue, and we actually talked about that in week 2. If you have a string like cat or ken, and you attempt to assign that to a variable, or sorry, if you want to treat it like a number, it's going to get treated as a 0 because it's a nothing. So simply just saying, hey, if that thing is greater than or equal to 0, that throws out all words, because all words are going to get resolved to 0. And that also throws out all my negative numbers. So that's just kind of like a good shorthand check for making sure that the thing is a number and it's greater than 0. Now these pipes right here is sometimes what they call those. That's a logical OR symbol. So those could be new to you. There's ands and there's ORs. So I'm saying if that value is non-numeric or negative, is kind of what I'm checking there. Or, now this is something weird that we'll have to talk about. There's several ways that you can determine whether something is an integer or not. There is a function built into PHP called isInt. Now you just have to understand that I cannot, even if this was a face-to-face class and even if we met for 20 weeks, I can't show you all of the PHP functions, right? More often than not, if there's something you're looking for, there's a function probably built into the language which can take care of it for you. You are completely welcome to use the isInt function here. And so when you come across something and you're thinking, man, I wonder if there's a easier solution for this, well, you should Google it. Head over to the php.net, which is the documentation for PHP, which is really second to none. There's a lot of there's many resources for it. Me, I just want to do this a different way, so I'll show you what this says. So let's just worry about this side of the OR. So when you write a data type and you put it in parentheses like that, that's called casting. And that means you're going to take this variable and I'm converting it to an integer. Right? So when you convert something to an integer, you don't, like let's say we've got the number 3.5 and we're converting it to an integer. You never know what that's going to do until you read about it. It could round it up to 4, or it might just remove the decimal places and turn it into a 3. But in any case, like this conversion process, this is saying like, hey, if converting that number into an integer is not the same as the number itself, then it's not a whole number. Kind of a weird thing, right? So like, let's say 3.5 is what we're talking about here. 3.5 would get converted either to 3 or 4, and it wouldn't be equal to 3.5. However, if you put in a whole number like 4, and you convert it to an integer, it's going to be 4, and 4 would be equal to 4. So that's just how I chose to check for whole numbers. Like I said, there's an isInt function, which is built into the language, which is definitely more straightforward, but I try and avoid the PHP built-in functions because I'm not trying to abstract away the details, if that makes sense. You and the rest of the world you should feel free to use built-in functions if they're applicable, but I like to kind of do things the hard way because it kind of makes me learn, and I think it leads to a better discussion. So anyways, if that thing is not a positive number and it's not an integer, then I spit out this message, enter a positive integer. I could have been picky and had 2 separate messages, but I didn't. And then there's an else right here. No, there is no else. I'm sorry, I was just struggling to read my own code. Notice there is no else. That else right there is related to that. And so if there's no problems, then you're going to get just the H1 saying checkerboard. So this chunk up here is just a big old block of data validation. I literally think that's about the easiest that I could have done here. I don't know if that seems complicated. The good news is you're going to get a ton of practice with it, but I think that's literally the easiest scheme I could have done to do a good job with this. So let me show you how that stuff plays out. Alright, so notice it says checkerboard. Do you remember the default case where like there was no errors? That's what that is. If I take this and turn it into something like -5, right, there's one of those errors. If I turn that into like a word like cat, kind of the same error. If I have nothing submitted at all, I get some kind of a weird error like that. Let me show you kind of how to get that one, because that's an interesting one. So the way you might be wondering, well, how do you ever get to this page without submitting data and without editing the URL? Well, if you just try and open up the process page straight away, I'll also show you the other thing. So the first thing you do is you realize, hey, the PHP is not being processed, so you have to remember take everything through localhost, or sorry, through htdocs and replace it with localhost. I'm still in a sling, so I don't know, I'm getting a little bit better about things. So if you go straight to that page, well, there's not going to be any data there. And if you want to fake data, just showing you, you can put a question mark, and it's called dim, and I set a value like that. You might think, what's the use of that? Well, if you just want to test a page without having to submit the whole form, you can do that. So at this point, we have thoroughly discussed the error messages. So there's multiple flavors of the error message, and if there's no error message, it's just an H1 saying checkerboard, which is what you see there. So here we work our way down. None of that is any different. Now you'll notice there's some table stuff in a couple classes, and we'll talk about those in a minute here. So let's go down to the block of PHP. So my PHP is within inside of the div. You don't have to have this div. You could just put it straight in the body. I don't care. So the first thing I do is I spit out that error message, saying whatever it is. And so now here's where we get to the repetition part of things. So there's going to be 2 loops in this scenario, and that's kind of difficult that your first loop assignment has a nested loop in it. This very well could be the first nested loop you've ever seen. So I've got 2 counters, I and j. So when you're writing a loop, you should know this. There's some programming prerequisite to the class. You need a variable to keep track of how many iterations of your loop you've done. So I called one I and I called one j. If you needed another counter, you'd probably call it k. Some people call them things like counter. That's fine, but the whole rest of the world typically uses I and j as their counters if they need them. Since I've got 2 loops, I need an I and a j. Someone might be wondering if we could do this with a for loop. You could, but I'm not showing you for loops in this class. Alright, so here's the recipe for this, and I'm going to make a video on this. I haven't done it yet, but I'm going to, for spitting out HTML tables. So tables are kind of a weird thing. They have a negative reputation, but in PHP, sometimes it's the best way to display things. So what I do, notice my loops start here, so that runs from there to there. So here's what I do. You don't know ahead of time how many rows and columns are going to be in your table, but you do know that every table starts with a table tag, and every table ends with a table tag. So I just put that, the first thing I do is I echo the opening table tag and the closing table tag, and then I understand that the loops go in between. So I have those outside of, and then when I go into my while loop, so while I is less than dim, right? So dim is like 3 or 4, that's how many rows or columns you do. And the way to think about this, in my mind, is this first loop, or you want to call that the outer loop sometimes, that is what's going to draw the rows, and the inner loop is going to draw the columns. That's just the way to think about this. So I say while I is less than dim, and so the other thing I do right here, this is kind of a tricky one, is I set j to 0. Notice I already set it to 0 up here, so that kind of looks redundant, and it kind of is, but the issue is that the j is used to draw the cells in each row, and so let's say the first row has 5 cells in it. That counter is going to go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it's going to bail out of this loop right here. But when it bails out of that loop, it's because j gets to 4, and every time for each new row, you need to keep resetting j to 0. Otherwise, it doesn't work out right. So that does have to be there. So that's inside of my first loop. And so the inner loop draws the rows. You see that chunk of code right there? So similarly to how I had the table outside of the loop, I have an opening tr outside of the inner loop, and the closing tr outside of that inner loop. That's just the recipe. So you're going to be doing a lot of tables. Tables are a very common thing to spit out in PHP, so it might be it's always confusing when you first start looking at it, but it's always the same pattern. So opening and closing table tags outside of your outer while loop, opening and closing row tags outside of your inner loop. Alright, so, this works right. I didn't mean to make it work right. Let me break it. Show you kind of what I did. Alright, so here's my inner loop. This is what draws the TDs. So if you haven't seen tables before, they're made up of these little container tags called TDs. So opening TD, closing TD. And so what I do, remember that red and black pattern? If you're going to alternate between red and black, there's a couple ways to do it. You can do it with a flag variable, but I just like to use math on it. So I go inside of that inner loop. I say if j mod 2 is equal to 0. That is another way of saying if it's even or odd. So the mod operator is that %. So like, for example, 0 mod 0 is 0. So it's going to be red. 1 mod 2 is not 0. So it's going to be black. 2 mods 2 is 0. So it's going to be red. 3 mod 2 is going to be 1. So it's going to be black. So it's just going to alternate back and forth between red and black. Now, let me show you how this works out. Actually, so I'm almost done here. So I've got a little if here, and my if is just flipping back and forth between red and black. And then here I'm incrementing my j, which is that counter for that loop. And then right after I spit out that closing table row, I increment this counter. So I didn't point that out because I'm just kind of showing you what this looks like. At this point, we've talked about all the HTML. Let's see how it goes. It's not going to be perfect. This is kind of the normal attempt at it. So you notice that it's not it is alternating, but it's not alternating correctly. This is one of those things you just discover from doing it. So it goes red, black, red, black, red, black, red, black, red, black, red, black, red, black. And that looks like it kind of works. Let's put a 5 in here, see what it does. Right, it's just not a checkerboard. And so you realize that it's not just alternating. It's also that each new row needs to alternate as well. And there's many ways you can do that. But a way you can do it, you can just take my word on it. This is just math. But if you add up I plus j, oops, I'm struggling to type here. If you add up I plus j and you mod it by 2, that'll actually solve all your problems. I'd love to sit here and explain why it would work, but it's kind of hard enough to do anything in this format. But that gives you the thing that you're looking for. Now, I encourage you, I'm telling you, there's other ways you could do this. Like you could have flags keeping track of the last row, keeping track of the last cell. There are other ways to do it, but this is I'm sure that this is the most succinct way to make it alternate correctly. And this works correctly for odd numbers of rows and even numbers of rows. So I'm just telling you, that's a good way to do it. And that is the assignment. Right, so we're spitting out a dynamic table, and I managed to flip back and forth between red and black with this little equation right here. So that's everything. Now there's only one thing that I think that I want to fix here, and I'm not trying to make this video longer than it needs to be, but there is one problem with it, and I don't want to just act like it doesn't exist. And so I'll show you what it is. So functions well here, make this a 6. I'm just testing it with an odd, testing it with an even. You've seen that it doesn't work for something like a -4. It probably also doesn't work with like 3.14. Oh, it did. And so that is actually, so that problem right there is actually related to this problem. Like, see that notice right there? So there's a notice on line 58. So let me talk about what that is. So that problem is right here, and this is important to talk about. So notice it's saying, hey, what it was saying dim doesn't exist. Because I'm trying to do a while loop here, and I'm saying while I is less than dim. Well, what the heck is dim? And also, why did it do what it did when I put in a non-whole number? They are related. So the issue is, if you put in invalid values, the error message is working, but the problem is I need to find a way to make this whole table not happen. Right? Like that table shouldn't be drawn if you enter the word cat or you put in -6 or something like that. Just the reason it doesn't get drawn for cat and -6 is that 0 is less than, right? Or sorry, 0 is greater than -3, or it's greater. It's right. I don't know. It's hard to explain what I'm trying to say here. But if you put in garbage input, this loop just doesn't work the way that it's supposed to. But if you put in something that's not garbage, like 3.14, then we need to find a way to not get in here. So here's the better solution. So what I should do is exercise a little bit of foresight and realize, hey, this whole chunk right here, that chunk just shouldn't happen. And so I'm going to show you a technique. It's kind of ugly to look at, but actually I'll do it the pretty way. But so anyways, I want to stop that from happening. So here's the approach. So what I should do is I should have an if, and I'll say if flag is equal to 1, then, and so see that if block right there, really this whole chunk of code right here should be in there. Sorry, I'm copying and pasting. It might look ugly. Where's that if block? You notice that I'm using syntax highlighting to figure out where the if block runs from. I also do not recommend moving around huge chunks of code like that. And if you do, certainly indent them. So I took everything I had and I just wrapped it inside of an if block. So only do this if a particular condition is true. And so you might be wondering, what the heck's that flag variable? Well, I'm glad you asked. So I'm going to create that flag variable. So I'll say flag equals 1. And if there's an error, then I'll set flag equal to 0. And my two errors are represented by those two cases. So perhaps me fixing this mistake might help you to understand things a little bit better. So when I detect an error, I set the flag to 0. When I detect an error, I set the flag to 0. I assume it's true, and I only do the whole table if that flag is true. So that's called a flag. It's a good technique. I save it. Let me go reload this and show you the new improved result. So this is the result of submitting nothing. Now I don't get a warning anymore. And let's make sure that it all works correctly on good data. And now I can show you this one. So 4.5, it's not just going to, so before it gave you an error but actually drew the chart. Now it's going to give you an error and not draw the chart. So that was a solution to the lab. You are welcome and encouraged to do things in your own way. So I like this exercise more than last week because here hopefully we're not struggling as much with getting XAMPP up and running, FTPing your files, naming things, connecting things together. This is just good old-fashioned programming. So there's one thing I need to talk about, and that is the styling of these cells. All right, so those cells in my table, some of them are red, some of them are black. Now the way that I styled them, I just put a class on them. So one's class red, one's class black. I'll show you what the HTML looks like the CSS for my table. So dot black, background, dot red, background red. That's what makes things red and black. The other parts of the table is this one right here, table, and so there's a rule called border collapse. Let me show you what that looks like if it's not on. Now, here's kind of a cool trick. I'm pretty sure it's not the most valid thing, but I'm going to do it. If you just misspell a CSS rule, it's kind of like it's not there at all. So let me show you what that looks like. Let me fix the input here. So do you see what border collapse does? So by default, tables have these little borders in them which kind of separate the cells. Now, I don't care whether you have those or not, but if you're wondering what border collapse is, that's border collapse. The only other rule I wrote is for the TDs, I gave them a fixed height and width. I don't care how tall you make them. You can make them 50 pixels if you want. You could make them 5 pixels if you want. But this is how I created squares, because by default, TDs are rectangular, and it doesn't really look like a checkerboard. So that's the HTML and CSS. So at this point, you should be getting a feel for how that goes. You might learn a couple CSS properties in this class, but it's not a huge part of most things. And if it is something that's just part of an assignment, I will show you exactly how to do it. So now, everything has been explained in the lab. So I hope this works well for you. Remember, this is awfully similar to the homework assignment for the week. Really, this is literally quite a bit more difficult than the assignment for the week. So hopefully this goes well for you, and then this should help out a lot with the assignment. Thanks for watching this video.